Yeah, I think that'll work great.
Very good. Well, I'm really excited to start digging around for truffles.
Totally, me too. I'm waiting for the live stream to go live, but it's like not going.
Huh. The YouTube
It should be
live.
open. Yeah.
I did so.
There it is. All right.
All right. Well, you have a lot of watches already on those videos, and people constantly asking on Facebook if it was recorded. I missed it. My computer froze.
Totally.
So
we're getting a lot of good YouTube usage.
Yes. Hi, Rebecca. And some of those truffles, I realized that I have seen them, and I just thought it was a little weird mushroom poking up out of the ground or something, you know? Or the really, really ugly ones, I realized I've seen some of those, like some of the more surface ones in the moss and that actually do submerge from the duff. And now, like, now that I saw the presentation, I'm like, oh, I have picked weird things like that that smelled bad and just been like, ew, what's that? And threw it away.
Yeah, I plan to devote a lot more attention to those subsurface fungi now, or subsurface mushrooms, I suppose.
My problem is that you have to ignore the above ground ones to see the underground ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that.
Me neither.
It made more sense if it was June and it was dry and there's nothing else to do.
Yeah, exactly.
I did some last minute publicity on a couple of Facebook pages and shot an email out to my email list and stuff. So should get a good turnout. Yeah, that's
Well, it's about 7:34, 7:35, so we can start if we want to start. Joanne, do you want to introduce Levon?
I'd be pleased to.
Yay.
All right, I'm ready. Levon Durr is a longtime member of the Mycological Society. He's been very active and takes on responsibility, and he's a real asset to our club. He's also the owner of Fungaia Farms, a local mushroom company in Eureka, California that produces fresh mushrooms and products for mushroom cultivation. He's been an organic farmer and permaculture teacher for over 15 years. He moved to Humboldt County in 1997 to run an organic farm at Heartwood Institute. And while at Heartwood, Levon was introduced to the idea of mycoremediation and its ability to heal damaged landscapes. Inspired to learn more about mycology, Levon studied mushroom cultivation and mycorestoration with Paul Stamets at Fungi Perfecti. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Levon Durr.
Thanks, Joanne. And thanks to the HBMS for having me. Hi, everyone. And thanks for joining on this nice chilly evening in Humboldt or wherever you're watching from. We've got a nice little frost advisory tonight. So it sounds like it's going to be a chilly, chilly evening. So tonight we're going to discuss some of the basic steps for cultivating your own edible and medicinal mushrooms. We have started our farm in 2011, just outside Eureka. We have a laboratory and a fruiting and incubation facility where we produce culinary and medicinal mushrooms, and we also grow spawn for other folks to grow mushrooms, commercial and hobbyist mushroom cultivators. I'm going to talk about a few, sort of three of my favorite subjects. We're going to talk about cultivating mushrooms on straw, doing oyster mushroom cultivation, and we're going to talk about log cultivation, and then integrating edible mushrooms into your garden and your landscape. So I'll open up some questions, like I'll do a little reminder right before I wrap up each category. And if there's some burning question that you have or something that I skipped over or missed, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we can address that. And then if we don't get time for questions right then, we'll have some more time at the end for a little Q&A, and we can kind of go back over stuff. I'm using Zoom on PowerPoint on Zoom, just getting the hang of it here. Cool. So general mushroom cultivation. There's lots of different styles out there, everything from sterilization to outdoor inoculations, and a lot of really great user-friendly methods that don't involve the need for a laboratory or very much sterile technique at all, if any. There's ways that involve a lot of plastic and a lot of energy and fossil fuels, and ways that you can avoid that. Here at Fungaia Farm, part of our mission is kind of to promote more ecologically based mushroom production. Though we do use plastic and incorporate different sterilization techniques, we try to reduce what we can and also promote to other people ways that we can produce mushrooms in a more ecologically balanced way. So first, I know this is basic for all those mycologists out there, but I just like everyone to be on the same page and have the same terminology for the rest of the talk. So if we're discussing something or whatever, I come across a lot of people that are passionate about mushrooms and maybe aren't familiar with the terminology. So during the talk, if we say a fruiting body, we're actually going to just be talking about the mushroom itself, the part of the mushroom that you would cook up and eat on your pizza. And we say the mycelium, we're looking at the vegetative part of the mushroom, which is growing underground or in the substrate, in the wood or in the straw of the mushroom, of the fungi. So the mushroom life cycle. Another thing I like to kind of touch upon is people ask a lot of times if we're using spores or if they can grow with spores. Primarily what we're using is the mycelium. So we're looking at sterile tissue cultures, sterile tissue from usually the stem, or if it has a really thick cap, we can get tissue out of the cap and we can clone a mushroom. But more often than not, we're relying on bigger mushroom companies that breed using spores sometimes, and breed really nice, healthy, strong, productive strains of oyster or shiitake mushroom. We can germinate spores, we can clone stuff from the wild, but most of the time we're kind of leaving that up to breeders, so to speak, kind of like ordering your carrot seed, rather than trying to save your own carrot seed and having it cross with Queen Anne's lace or what have you. So just like to touch upon those just real quick, just so we're all on the same page with terminology. So what we start with in our laboratory is like I mentioned, the actual tissue of the mushroom, or we buy some mycelium from somebody else, a known, verified, nice, healthy strain of oyster mushroom or lion's mane or Pleurotus pulmonarius, the phoenix oyster, and things like that. So the agar is just a nutrified medium that is used in all kinds of laboratories for culturing a wide variety of things. We do use some special things that the mushrooms like a little bit more than you might if you were growing out strep throat or some a culture to see if you had strep throat. But we add agar and barley malt and nutritional yeast and sometimes wood and sometimes peptone to increase the protein for different strains that like that. But basically, this is generally how everything starts out. It's kind of like your sourdough starter or your yogurt culture. We're just transferring mycelium to another medium, or we're keeping it alive and fresh on Petri dishes. For long-term storage, we'll throw it on a test tube and do an even more nutrient-rich medium. We might put a little wood in there or a higher ratio of sugars and nutrients, and then we can store it in the test tube for a few years. We can store it on a Petri dish for 6 to 12 months, and then it gets kind of tired and we have to transfer it onto new medium. But this is kind of how everything starts in our laboratory. From there, it goes on to grain spawn. We do a little liquid culture, but grain spawn is really user friendly. It works really great, especially when we get to the oyster mushroom production. We'll talk about that in a second. But the grain spawn basically is just sterilized wheat berries we use because we can get wheat berries cheaper than most other grains in our area. And the wheat berries are soaked and then sterilized in an autoclave. And then you can see down here in the bottom left corner of this jar of wheat berries, the mycelium from the agar was placed in the jar, and now it's growing all through the wheat berries. And then what we have, what is called grain spawn. And it literally is just a bunch of tiny little bits of grain now completely embedded and encoded with the mycelium, the strain of choice that we're trying to grow. And it just gives us a super nutrient rich means to transfer the mycelium to the next substrate, like I mentioned, kind of like your sourdough starter. So this grain spawn can then go on to plug spawn, sawdust spawn, or onto the pasteurized straw. So now let's talk a little bit about oyster mushroom production. So oyster mushrooms are really easy to grow, super, super prolific. They have one of the highest levels of biological efficiency of BE. They'll turn 10 pounds of straw into up to 10 pounds of mushrooms, partly because mushrooms are 90% water, but also because they have just a high biological efficiency of converting their food into fruiting bodies, into the actual mushrooms. So just we like to kind of emphasize this and headline this for local and hobbyists like cultivators, because it's really easy to grow, it's really forgiving, and the whole process can be done after the grain spawn's made outside in non-sterile environments with non-sterile substrate too. So we're going to get to that in a sec. So first we start by shredding our straw, which isn't totally necessary. I've successfully grown oyster mushrooms many times by just pasteurizing the straw and stuffing it into buckets or bags. But the mycelium does appreciate a much tighter substrate. As those of you that wildcraft oyster mushrooms, you'll see they grow on woods, they grow on logs, they grow on dead trees. So alders and oaks and things like that. In our area, you'll find lots of oyster mushrooms. So we're sort of mimicking that environment for the mycelium. We choose wheat straw when available. It has a higher level of protein for the oyster mycelium compared to rice or oats, but those also do work. Partly the reason this technique is so successful is because the straw isn't that nutritious, and so it doesn't harbor as much molds and things as, say, if you used coffee grounds or alfalfa and more nutrient-rich substrates. So we have, you can't really see it in the corner here, but we have a leaf mulcher that we bought at the hardware store and to grind up your yard waste for your leaves. And we run the straw through that. It's basically just a weed whacker blade. People do just use weed whackers in garbage cans, in barrels. They put the straw in there and they put the weed whacker in and then turn it on. It's a dusty process, however you go about it. But we shred the straw up. You can see in the bottom right corner here, this is the nice shredded straw. So it's a much smaller particulates. We're going to be able to stuff our containers a lot denser. The mycelium won't have to jump big gaps and voids. So it'll grow much faster, and we'll also have more substrate in a smaller area than if it was looser. So that's the advantage of shredding. The straw is then placed into an insulated 55-gallon stainless steel drum, and then we pasteurize it with hot water at 170 degrees for 1 hour. This can also be done with steam. Hot water is a little easier to come by. Low tech, you can even just put this over a fire or over an outdoor burner, or you can even boil hot water and then pour it into a container with the straw, you know, probably outside or what have you, and then cover it and let it sit for an hour. So this can be done on a small scale too, with just a big pot and some hot water, or if you have access to steam, if you have a boiler or a steamer. Then the straw is inoculated. So we pull the straw out. We have a big, long stainless steel table. This also can be done just on a nice, clean piece of plastic or a clean table. I've done this with small groups of students, you know, little children, ages, you know, 8, 9. It's real basic, real simple. You can see on this table of straw, you'll see all this little white specks. That's the grain spawn that's now getting mixed into the straw. So we let the straw cool to about 70 degrees. And then we took the grain spawn, we sprinkled it in, and we massaged it into the straw. Now we have all these little inoculation points throughout the substrate, covered in mycelium, all these little wheat berries, the grain spawn, all covered in mycelium and inside the wheat berries even. And now that is going to jump out onto its new substrate, which is going to be the fruiting substrate, which is the shredded wheat straw, the shredded pasteurized wheat straw. So here's like our little oyster kits we make. We use biodegradable cellulose plant-based plastics, you know, for our kits. We stuff the straw, the inoculated straw in there. And this is about 4 or 5 days into the inoculation. This bag has holes punched into it to allow for airflow. And I see someone asked the question, how do you avoid mold contamination? That's a great question. So the reason why this is a pasteurization method and not a sterilization method is because this only works with oysters. The Pleurotus ostreatus is so aggressive that the mycelium will outgrow you know, other contaminants and competitors faster than they can germinate, and literally will encase mold spores and other fungal and yeast spores faster than they can germinate and colonize the substrate. So this only works with oysters. This is why we're kind of getting to this first in the talk, because it's so user friendly. You can even just take an oyster stem from the wild or from the store and roll it up in a piece of wet cardboard, and the mycelium will grow onto the cardboard, and you can put that onto pasteurized straw. Once you get into other substrates, like I mentioned, like the company that makes the little coffee mushroom kits, coffee oyster mushroom kits, they use ground coffee waste. It's so nutrient rich that you can get a lot more molds and stuff. Somebody asked, what is your seed and spawn ratio? So seed, a 4-pound bag of grain spawn will inoculate about a half a bale of straw. So it's like 1 to 50 or something. It's a lot. You can't go too high because, of course, you will get, you know, you do need that mycelium to grow fast enough to outcompete the other contaminants. But this is the beauty of you know, oyster mushroom cultivation. So here you see 10 days later. So super fast. This is the Ferrari of mycelium. This is also the mycelium we use for mycoremediation to break down hydrocarbons and other contaminants like in diesel and oil spills, because again, it grows so fast and is so aggressive. And it's also a delicious, mushroom at the same time. Somebody asked, do you think industrial cardboard waste as a substrate would result in mushrooms leaching lead, etc.? Yeah, we'll get to that. Come back to that. That's a great question. So 10 days later, you see how fast this is happening. Yes, there's molds on the yeast. Yes, on the straw. Yes, there's yeast. There's other fungi. There's weed seed. Sometimes there's a clod of dirt and we get a little contamination. Sometimes there's some weird muddy weed stem in the straw that we didn't see, and we get a little contamination, but it's very, very minor. So yeah, we'll get into the fruiting in a second. Trying to get my screen to advance here. This is 20 to 30 days later. In warm weather, this is about 20 days. So again, it is one of the fastest growing mushrooms. This mushroom's also been looked at for disaster situations where protein-rich food is needed to be produced as fast as possible. If there's agricultural waste, if there's corn stalks, if there's wheat, if there's straw of any kind, agricultural waste, we can pasteurize it and produce mushrooms in like 20 days from inoculation. So it's just a wonderful food source, and again, takes very little fossil fuel input because we don't have to do the sterilization, which is necessary for most of sawdust culturing for a lot of the culinary mushrooms. We'll talk about that in a minute. So once we get into fruiting, we have a really mild climate here in Humboldt County on the coast specifically, but even inland at most locations, except for maybe really high elevation where it gets really, really cold. And even in hotter regions that get, in the 90s and hundreds, that does not mean you can't cultivate mushrooms, because lo and behold, we always have these cool, wet winters, falls and cool, wet springs. So if you're growing somewhere where it's, freezing cold in the winter time or snowing, then that's not going to be a good time to fruit the mushrooms, but you can still do log culture. If you're looking to grow oyster mushrooms and it gets really hot in the summer, you're just going to want to plan around fruiting the mushrooms in the spring or fruiting the mushrooms in the fall, which goes for outdoor bucket cultivation, like with these oysters here, or log cultivation, or cultivating your garden. It's all kind of the same temperatures that you're looking for and the same humidity levels that you're looking for, just like the mushroom fair and the myco blitz that we're having. It's mushroom season, so we know that October and November are great mushroom times. We had a question about temperature during mycelium and fruiting. Great question. So we have a few different oyster mushrooms here. Up in the top left corner, we have is the Pleurotus. This is the tropical mushroom. It's Pleurotus jamor. It's a pink oyster. Now that mushroom really prefers temperatures above 70, 75, even 80 degrees. So you've got to couple that with high humidities of 80, 90% humidity. So that one's much trickier to grow. It can work pretty good if you can achieve those temperatures and that humidity. So one of the problems with outdoor cultivation is you need airflow, and it needs to be warm, and you need to get the humidity right. To the right of that is what we call the blue oyster. This is the Pleurotus Oystratus columbinus variation, which is a really dense clustering dark oyster, and it prefers temperatures in the 50s and works really great almost year round here on the coast, but really prefers our cool falls, winter, and cool spring. Once the weather warms up, even here in Eureka, we switched to the bottom left corner here, the white oyster, the regular old Pleurotus ostriatus, and it will handle temperatures into the 60s and mid 70s. Really, really easy to grow, really versatile. Both of the blue and the white will handle somewhat similar temperatures and just grow a little bit slower. But once you get above like 70, the blue's not that happy. And once you get below 50, the white's not that happy. You can see different techniques that we used with the pink oyster. We have our biodegradable cellulose bag for our kits. With the blue here, you can see we've drilled holes into 5-gallon buckets. And then down here, this is more the commercial technique of polytubing, where we stuff big bags with the pasteurized inoculated straw. Now, I have just stacked buckets like this lower left corner here with the white oyster growing. I have just stacked up buckets outside. It works great. We do have a lot of oysters do get larvae. So depending on how warm it is out and how prolific the mushroom flies are, you can get larvae in your mushrooms if you're not harvesting them really fast. And you do need to get humidity levels up to say 80–90%. So that can be achieved with draping some plastic over, allowing some airflow, or just picking the perfect time of year when it's cool enough that you don't have a lot of mushroom fly larvae laying eggs on your mushroom, and you have nice high humidity levels. So, you know, just like with gardening and things, this takes a little finesse of placement and timing and stuff like that, but it's totally doable. Lots of people just grow oyster mushrooms outside or set up small little hoop houses dedicated to their mushroom production, where they can raise the humidity up, allow a little airflow, cross ventilation, maybe put a little screen up to keep flies out, and then you're off and running with lots and lots of fresh food. So hopefully that answered your temperature. Oh, somebody also asked about temperature during mycelial germination. So perfect temperature for what's called the incubation period of the colonizing the substrate. So most of all of these and a lot of everything we're going to look at today is really going to prefer temperatures in the 60s and 70s. So that's kind of the ideal temperature to actually do the incubation. Now, oysters will be forgiving if it does drop down into the 50s, and it will just grow a little bit slower, but the challenges can come when the mycelium colonizes the substrate too slow, and you do have other stuff start germinating and contaminants that can come along. So there's a fine line there between trying to do it at too low of temperatures. Yeah. Of course, what you don't want is mushrooms fruiting in your house. I thought this was a really beautiful picture of a gorgeous white oyster cluster growing out of somebody's baseboard. Okay, now let's talk about log cultivation. And if you have any other questions about oyster, we can type them in and we can get back to that at the end. Log cultivation is one of the most ecologically friendly and easy to learn cultivation methods. This, unlike most commercial shiitake, maitake, nameko, lion's mane, enoki, all the commercial mushroom production is produced from sterilization of sawdust, and it has a massive energy input to fully sterilize the medium. Well, lucky for us, Mother Nature is already sterile. These trees are already sterile inside the wood when we harvest the logs. This is just a great thing for our area too, partly because of our temperatures and our humidity and our lovely Mediterranean climate that we have, but also because we have so much small diameter trees that can be turned into delicious protein-rich food. So we're really big on promoting this for home and commercial cultivation, for communities, families, restaurants, farmers markets. lots of different applications for log cultivation. We're going to look at kind of have a lot of pictures of shiitake with this because we grow a lot of shiitake here at Fungaia Farm. But we at the end of the logs, we're going to also talk about the other species you can grow on logs and some easy techniques. Great question, Jocelyn. We'll get to that in just a sec. So the logs, log and tree selection is part of the art of figuring out how to do this. Again, this is some alder that we get calls from property owners where the alders are just literally taking over their roadways, and they've lost access to sections of their property. Tan oak that's just choking the forest, huge fire hazard, doing fuels reduction, thinning the forest. You know, this is a great practice that is happening more and more, especially with all the fires in California, and can be turned into, like I mentioned, delicious protein-rich food. So here we have a stack of some red alder from up in Big Lagoon area, and we're doing very specific tree selection. So we're looking for nice, straight, 5 to 8 inch diameter logs, anywhere from 3 to 4 feet long. The fatter the log, the shorter I start cutting it, because I've learned, especially with shiitake, if you're going to be picking the log up for the next 5 years, you really don't want it to weigh 65 pounds. So we started, you know, being more realistic about the length and the weight of our logs. This is just a short little screenshot of the mushroom tree compatibility that we have up on our website. I couldn't fit all of it on the screen because it's really long, but the common question I get is, what woods can I grow mushrooms on? And the short answer, and as you've probably learned, those of you that are into mycology, there's always exceptions. And you hear mycologists, even Noah last night, say, oh, and most of things do this except for, and it goes the same for tree species selection for mushroom cultivation. Unless, of course, you're looking at turkey tails. They grow on just about everything. But the short answer of woods that you're trying to find is non-aromatic hardwoods. So, and don't forget about the semi-hardwoods, because they are excellent, like cottonwood, poplar, aspen, chestnut, and also small, fast-growing trees like that. But the oaks and even tan oak, which isn't a true oak, does amazing for shiitake. That's what this first picture that's shiitake on tan oak. So you can find this on our website under facts and resources, and you can compare what woods you have access to and what mushrooms you want to grow. But generally speaking, you're looking for alders, you're looking for white oaks, you're looking for black oaks, you're looking for poplars, willows, things like that for most of the species that are really popular. Somebody asked, what about maple? Maple, great wood, super. It's just on after elm in this list that I couldn't fit on the screen. But yeah, definitely check that out, because that really helps people kind of figure out what woods they have. What woods you aren't going to use is redwood. You're not going to use cedar. Unfortunately, nothing really likes fruit woods. I get a lot of questions about, oh, I'm cutting this apple tree down, or I'm pruning this apple tree. I've got some big logs. Fruit woods don't seem to be very good. I'm always up for experimenting, trying out new things. But of course, this is very labor intensive log cultivation. And so picking the right woods, picking really healthy, nice, straight wood with intact bark that doesn't have any rot or any blemishes or any other fungal growth or infections growing on it is really important to your success of your project. So to kind of walk you through this process, obviously this is usually like a 2 or 3 hour workshop that I give, but this will give you a nice little introduction. We have some great YouTube videos you can check out, and hopefully we can all get back together in person, and we will be offering hands-on workshops too on all this stuff. But to walk you through the basic steps of log cultivation is it all starts with the plug spawn. And as you can see in this picture here, these little wheat berries were the grain spawn. The agar went on the grain spawn went on the plug spawn goes into the logs. So this is what 2,000 plugs look like. The average plug ratio per log is about 50 to 60 plugs. So if you have 1,000 plug spawn, which costs you about 44 bucks, you will be plugging anywhere from 15 to 20 logs. And we'll get into kind of how much mushrooms that'll produce in a second. But the reason why this is much more ecological is because this same size bag of sawdust would only produce mushrooms a couple times, and you would only get a few pounds of shiitakes, like 1.5 pounds and then another 1.5 pounds maybe. And that would be it. That shiitake block would be done after all that energy sterilizing it. But because the wood, the tree is sterile inside, we inoculate it. There's so much dense food there that log's going to produce for years and years and years, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And it's going to produce a couple pounds of mushrooms each time, once or twice a year for the next 3 to 5 years. So the exponential amount of return with your fossil fuel input. So the plug spawn, right? We took the plug spawn, it's nice and colonized, and now we need to drill our logs. So you can see here, there's a little technique to speed things up. This is labor intensive, so cutting off time and labor is kind of crucial to making this, profitable at all. Obviously, if you're just doing a couple logs for yourself, a regular drill like this down here works just fine. We sell these, for $5 with a little depth setter on it. And you drill it in the depth of the dowel, and then you hammer the dowel in. These wheels here come in super handy, especially with a high-speed angle grinder. The drill's running at about 3,000 RPMs, whereas the angle grinder is running at about 10,000 RPMs. And these we order from Japan. These are a special Japanese plug spawn drill bit, and it's self-feeding bit that already has a depth setter machined on it, and it self-feeds into the log. So basically, as fast as you can touch the log, it drills a hole for you. So huge time saver. We get these custom made adapters that go with the drill bit, and you can find those on our website too. These we recommend for people as soon as you're doing 20 logs, 40 logs. It's worth the $40 because it cuts the time in half. Eric Christian said they work super great. I agree. So your next step is inserting the dowel. Super simple. This is a really basic procedure. People have great success. Failures come later on with lack of log care, which we're going to talk about a little bit. But the process of inoculation, super simple. It all can be done outside in open air. Yes, you're getting contamination on your dirty hand, getting it in onto the plug, but it just doesn't matter because the mycelium is living all inside that plug, and you're hammering it into this fresh, sterile wood, and you're sealing it in with wax. And so that process just outcompetes all the other, issues that you have by doing outdoor inoculation that you would with, say, sterilized sawdust or grain spawn or anything like that. Once you get up to the plug spawn stage, it's super user friendly to just be able to do. You can do the whole process outside. We can do about 1,000 logs an hour with 3 people. That's kind of like a real relaxed, like too, not like rushing. 2 people plugging. Plugging's kind of the slowest part of the process. Waxing goes pretty quick. The drilling goes pretty quick. Plugging is, like hammering a little nail in. You got to hold it and hammer it, so it's kind of tedious. We use, we have a bees soy wax blend that we sell now, and we go get little crock pots from the health food, from the thrift store. $5, get yourself a little crock pot. Of course, if you're only doing a couple logs, you can buy a pack of plugs, you know, for $14 and just do 2 logs because you want to try it out. Super fun. Once you want to scale that up and actually have mushrooms on a regular basis for your family, then we recommend, you know, the high-speed angle grinder, get a crock pot. Otherwise, you know, you can melt wax in a can or whatever. Somebody asks, is it okay if the wax sloughs off after a few months? Yeah, it's not optimal. Usually we try to get through the incubation period first, which is about a year. So that does happen. We were using straight soy wax and we noticed it was really brittle and it was chipping off a lot. So we started adding beeswax to the soy wax. Beeswax works really great. In this picture here, this is when we used to use cheese wax, which is petroleum based, and it just turns black over time. It works great, but then you know, I use these logs when they're finished 5-6 years later as mulch in my garden, and then there's all this weird petroleum wax all over them. So yeah, to answer your question, Jocelyn, hopefully the wax doesn't slough off. Some people don't do wax, especially on the East Coast where it rains a lot, but we have such dry summers that we really highly recommend people. A pound of wax is like $5. It'll do like 15 logs, you know, 10 to 15 logs. So it's way worth the money to seal the plugs and seal the ends of the logs. If you look here in the bottom right corner, left corner of the screen, you'll see this log was actually dipped in the crock pot of wax. And now they're painting over each dowel along the log, covering it up. So not only does it seal in the moisture, but it also protects the plugs and the ends of the logs from drying out and from other, you know, insects and other fungal spores floating around and such. So somebody asked about, what about sealing scars or bruises on the bark? That's a great question. One thing that happens when I take people out to harvest logs for mushroom cultivation is they act like we're harvesting firewood, and they start throwing the logs around and they start nicking them with their chainsaw. And I have to stop everybody and say, whoa, 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 wait a second. This bark is precious. I need this bark to last 5 years. The mushrooms want to push up out of the bark. As soon as the bark starts breaking down, the logs start rotting even faster. So it's really important to care for the bark first off. And yes, if there is a branch that is cut or there's a chainsaw wound on the bark, then we would seal that with wax too. So we're very liberal with the wax, especially with long, super dry summers here in Humboldt County, especially if you live inland somewhere where it's 90 or 100 degrees. We highly, highly recommend the wax. It really increases people's success rate. So yeah, great question. So this here is what we call the incubation period. So here's the real clincher. Sawdust spawn, sawdust inoculation for, say, shiitake as an example, because these are all shiitake logs right here, will fruit in about 3 months from inoculation. So sterilize the sawdust, inoculate it with some grain spawn or liquid culture, and 3 months later you have mushrooms. Inoculate a log, 13 months later you have mushrooms. So it's about planning ahead. If you want to have logs next year, you start now. If you want to have logs the year after that, you start next year, etc. So it's really important to not only understand what you're getting into and have the patience, but also know that this is a long-term project. Are you going to be moving? Do you have a good location? Do you have access to a lot of water? Things like that. So this is called the incubation period. There's a couple strains of mushrooms that do grow really fast. One that we're going to talk about at the end of this category, which is the Namako, the Philiota Namako, which we have had fruitings in about 6 months, 6 to 9 months. We've had our first fruiting off those logs. Shiitake, oysters, lion's mane, reishi can take anywhere from 12 to 14 to 16 months. It also depends on the type of wood. Some woods are much denser, and it seems the mycelium grows a little slower. Alder's a little lighter wood and seems to colonize really fast. So we usually have a turnaround of about 12 to 13 months. Oak can take a little bit longer, 14 to 16 months. Also, the diameter of the log. If the log is 8 inches in diameter, then it's going to take longer to colonize. Also, what comes into play is your plug ratio. You can see on this log stacked on the top here, we're about 3 inches apart with our plugs. If you go closer, you'll get faster colonization. If you go farther, you'll get farther apart, you'll get slower colonization. So that's really crucial. Somebody asked, how often do you moisten or water? Any tips for efficient moistening without a ton of runoff? Super great question. I was just going to get to that. So in this incubation period, right, these logs were inoculated. Oh, something I forgot to mention. The best time to harvest trees is during the dormancy. So November through March is basically now is the best time to harvest the wood. And there's 2 reasons for that. You can cut wood in the summertime and inoculate it, but the bark is supposedly much tighter on the log during the dormant period, and the sugars are much higher in the wood during the winters, because when the tree goes to leaf out, it expends all that energy. It loosens the bark so that branches can grow and the tree can grow, and it pumps all those sugars and everything out to its leaves. So you want to trap that in your log and your substrate by harvesting the wood during the dormancy. So again, not a fast, hard rule. Have done it outside of the dormancy. It does work, but again, you want these logs to last for years. So do everything you can to align all the stars for success. As far as back to the somebody's question, moistening and watering. These logs, as you can see, we're in Eureka. We have lots of redwood. We just have some dappled sunlight. These are, back on the corner of our property. We have a nice hose. We can basically just hand water these like once a week. When people get into drier situations, people in Willow Creek, people in Garberville, people at higher altitudes, the temperatures up in the 90s or 100s, then you need to take more drastic measures. We've had success with folks that have set up burlap or a shade cloth actually over the stacks of the logs, and they will then develop like a mister system and set misters on top of the burlap and have the misters go on every other day and moisten the logs, and then let them dry a little bit, and then wet them, and then let them dry a little bit. Another thing that we've been encouraging folks to do, especially in drier regions, and especially with some of our really dry summers that we've been having, is to go ahead and do a midsummer soak in a barrel. So take the logs and go ahead and soak them overnight, as if you're just giving them a nice deep watering, like your garden or your fruit trees or what have you. So those are a couple different techniques that can be used. We've had folks that have great success, even in Garberville, even in Willow Creek, even in Burnt Ranch or Hoopa. But they definitely have to use more water and take care of things. Yeah, you're welcome. So in Eureka, we pretty much just go back there once or twice a week with a hose and spray the logs down. The idea is that the bark gets to dry, the outside of the logs gets to dry out a little bit in between waterings. You don't want to just start growing weird moss and fungi and molds and stuff on the logs. You want them to have a nice breeze and be able to dry out. So you're not putting them in your dark, damp basement and covering them with plastic. You're more keeping them in an aerated environment with an occasional watering. So that's one of the key points to log care and what is called the incubation period while your logs become colonized. So here you have a cut end of the log. these are the alder logs, and this is at 6 months right here, and this is at 13 months right here. So this one's a little hard to see through the thick layer of wax, the 13 months, but the 6 months, let's talk about this for a sec. So this is red alder here, and you can see these white blotches on the log. That is literally where a plug was drilled in on the outside of the log. So we do this sort of diamond pattern of plugs where we put a plug, 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 plug all around the circumference of the log. And that mycelium impregnates into the wood. And now remember, it's one genetically identical strain of mycelium. So when it meets up with itself, it just fuses back into one giant organism growing inside of that log. So this is, you know, what woodworkers would call spalting. This is the mycelium embedding itself into the wood. And you can see this is about 6 months, it's about 50%. So that's like right on track. Whereas down here we have this log, this is almost 90% colonized. You can see a little bit of the red alder in a couple little corners that still aren't colonized. This is about at the point where we would be ready to fruit the log. Again, that was 13 months incubation period. So if I inoculate the logs now in November, I'm going to see mushrooms of spring of 2022. Is that right? Yeah. So that's kind of how I have to think ahead. So everything I inoculate now is most likely, depending if it's a smaller log, like if it's a little 4-inch log, or if it's alder, I might get fruitings next fall. But realistically, everything I inoculate now, I will fruit the following spring of 2022, spring of 2022. So once the logs are fully colonized, and I'm monitoring that partly by looking at the ends of the logs, I'm checking for moisture, how dry the logs are getting in the summer. A lot of people, you know, we have, I don't know, 10 or 20% of our customers come to us and they tell us, my logs never fruited. And we go, did you ever water them? And they say, no. And we say, did you ever soak them? And they say, no. And we say, well, that's what you're missing. And so we've actually had people come home, and people from other companies that have gotten plug spawn and done their logs from other people's plug spawn and say, yeah, they never fruited. And we say, you should go home and soak those logs. 3 years later, 4 years later, they go home and soak the logs, and the logs fruit prolifically. So this is called forced fruiting. And the full immersion of the log forces all the air out, saturates the mycelium, and shocks it with the cold water and initiates a fruiting. It lets the mycelium know that it can produce these fruiting bodies, which are 90% water, and go through this tremendous expense of energy to produce all this mushrooms, right? It's a big undertaking for the organism living in that log. And as long as it has food in that log, it just keeps growing more mycelium. So it's sort of the end of this reproductive cycle of, oh, the vegetative growth has taken place. This is my territory. This is the log. This is as far as I can go. I'm ready to fruit and send my spores out into the world. Of course, shiitakes don't grow here, so it's kind of futile, but we're happy and we keep growing them, so they're happy. So again, this is the forced fruiting method. This can be done in a little kiddie pool, in a bathtub. You can do logs even shorter. You can do 1 foot logs. You could soak them in a bucket. You can soak them in a barrel, a clean trash can, anything that you can submerge the log. One thing about having something to weight down the logs with is they can become very buoyant, especially if you let them dry out too much, which is not good. But we saw this method that people are doing, where using steel bars in a barrel and then stacking the logs in and then filling the water up, and the logs float up and hit the bars, and then they stay submerged. So it works like a charm. So this is for folks that want to do 20 logs at a time. You know, those of you looking to do 2 logs could just soak your logs in a little kiddie pool in your backyard. And turn them over a couple times. Somebody asked, does it matter what time of year you do a forced fruit soaking? Yes. So we are initiating fruiting of mushrooms. That window just closed for us here on Eureka and will not open again until, say, April. So I'm not going to soak any more logs until April. It's too cold. The mushrooms are going to grow too slow, and it's just not worth it. My yields will be really, really low. But the rest of the time of the year, we have a little hoop house with some screen on the ends, and it creates just high enough humidity that we can fruit our logs from April to November, basically all summer, all spring, all summer, and all fall in Eureka. Now, if you live inland, like especially this person that just asked, does it matter what time of year? Yes. Obviously, you're not going to soak your logs anywhere in December and January and February. But unless you live in the tropics, I'll take that back. But if you live somewhere it's really, really hot and really, really dry, you're also not going to soak your logs anywhere from June to October if you live in Hoopa, right? So it's too hot unless you really, really had some, you know, underground hoop house or something where you could keep it cool and raise the humidity up. But in most cases, you're going to soak and fruit your logs in the spring and the fall, which works out perfect because these logs can be fruited twice a year and will produce in upwards of 1 pound to 2 pounds of mushrooms each time. So in your first harvest, the logs paid itself back twice over. And you're going to now need to rest this log, which is called the resting period, for at minimum of 3 months. So if you soak your logs in May and fruit them all, then you might as well just wait till October to soak them again, and they have this beautiful resting period. On the coast, we can squeeze in 2 fruitings. Most of the time, we have a lot of logs that we kind of just end up doing 2 fruitings on our logs each spring, summer, and fall, because it just works out good that way. But if you were really pushing the production of the fruiting to happen, you could squeeze in, if you lived on the coast somewhere it was cooler, you could squeeze in a April fruiting, April, May, June, July fruiting, July, August, September, October fruiting. So you could squeeze in through 3 fruitings. Someone asked, are there diminishing returns for extended resting periods? No, it has been proven that the longer the logs are allowed to incubate initially, the better the first and fruitings then forth are. So you can prematurely try to fruit your logs, is what I'm trying to say. So it's really important to let them fully colonize. They did a test of trying to fruit logs at like 10 months and 14 months, and the logs at 14 months produced better for longer over the next course of years than the logs that were forced fruit too early. But as far as resting period, it has to be at least 3 to 4 months of a resting period. So there's no diminishing returns of waiting longer than that. There's just diminishing returns of doing it shorter than that. And then someone asked, how long do you soak the logs? Great question. So that also depends heavily on how dry you've let your logs get. So unfortunately, people let their logs dry out too much. They don't water them sufficiently during our dry period. If you live somewhere where you get summer rains on the East Coast, if anyone's watching this and you get summer rains, obviously you have to worry a lot less about watering your logs prolifically during the summer. They're expecting, you need like an inch of rain a week or something, I think they say, to keep the logs saturated. So you either need to create that artificially, or that needs to be happening by natural rain falling. But as far as the soak period time, you're going anywhere from 12 to like 24 hours. And sometimes I'll push it longer. If logs have gotten drier, I'll even do 36 hours. There's a cutoff point where the log becomes so saturated, the mushrooms start to pin, and then the stems of the mushrooms are really soggy and can actually rot. So you can have adverse effects of a long period of soaking. What I find more helpful is just to do a 12 to 24 hour soak, see if that was sufficient enough. If it wasn't, wait for 2 or 3 months and then soak the logs again. A great anecdote story is I took a friend out harvesting logs, and he wanted to do 20 logs and I was going to do 20 logs, and we went out and we got a couple thousand plugs. We grew a bunch of plugs. We went out, we harvested the wood. He lived up in McKinleyville. He took his logs up there. It was so windy at his house. I could not believe it. He swore to me he was watering the logs all summer. Fall came. What you often will get on proficiently like watered logs after 12 to 13 months, you will get it. Sometimes you'll get a mushroom pop up from a heavy rain. And that will let me know sometimes that that batch is ready. But other times I can just see that it's fully colonized and I'll go ahead and soak it and see if it's ready to pin. If it's not, that's fine. I restack it. I let it rest for a few months and I soak it again. But he calls me and I say, hey, I soaked my logs. Same batch, same wood, same trees, same inoculation time. I say, wow, all my logs are fruiting. I just harvested 25 pounds of mushrooms. He calls me up. He says, I didn't get anything. So I say, all right, I'm going to drive up and check out your logs. So I head up to McKinleyville. I walk in his backyard. They're like balsa wood. He let them get bone dry. These logs were so light. I said, oh my gosh, you need to soak these logs again. You did not soak them long enough. He's like, well, I soaked them overnight for like 8 or 9 hours. I said, no, go for like 24. He soaks them 24 hours. At this point, it's like late November. We have a cold snap. It's freeze. It's too cold. The logs never fruit. Lo and behold, he calls me March 10th. He says, all the logs fruited. I just harvested 30 pounds of mushrooms. The lesson there was that he didn't water his logs well enough in the summer, but his logs took 15 months to fruit. Mine took 12. So it wasn't that he didn't get mushrooms. It was just he had to wait longer. And that soaking basically just watered the logs. And that's why we're recommending to people to go ahead and try that in, say, just the middle of summer. We had another question. Would force fruiting doesn't sit right with me? Is it a mindful practice? That's funny. So it's basically just like a heavy rain that's happening to the logs. And if that happens really a heavy downpour in say October, all my logs will fruit. So it's just rare that we get that when temperatures are above 65 and it's pouring rain. So, but I better keep moving along here. So after fruiting, at about 7 to 8 days, you'll get pinning. If you don't get pinning in 17 to 8 days, the logs either weren't ready to fruit, were too dry to fruit, or needed some other condition, was too cold or too hot. But this is basically what you're seeing is the beginning sign of pinning for the shiitake. And then the care for the mushrooms while they're growing, we like to take our logs and get them out of the rain because they're just more soggy sitting out in the rain. So if you have an eave or a hoop house or some kind of tent that you can put up over them, also slugs are an issue. So we like to put them somewhere where we can keep an eye on them a little bit more. A lot of people do just leave them out in the rain, and that's fine too, especially if they're just for yourself and you don't mind just drying them out a little bit. Okay, so we're going to go over other log culture techniques. You can see reishi on the left here and namako on the right. Partially buried namako logs are a great, super lazy way to produce mushrooms. Now, unlike shiitakes, where I can fruit mushrooms on demand, say, oh, Thanksgiving is coming. Oh, I have a market I want to get to. Oh, I need a bunch of mushrooms for my spice mix or my tinctures. I can soak a bunch of logs and get a bunch of mushrooms. With the namako, not so much. They're fruiting right now in our backyard. These are a cool weather mushroom that we put in our garden near where we already have drippers. We cover them with straw or mulch, and the moisture from the ground allows the colonization of the logs to happen so fast that we've had fruitings within 6 months of burying these logs. They love alder. Super delicious, super nutritious mushroom. They do have a slight gelatinous coating on them, which totally dissolves away in the pan. It's not like okra or agar, something that stays gelatinous later on. It totally dissolves. They have a wonderful crunchy walnut-like flavor, and a really popular mushroom in Asia. Reishi, a medicinal mushroom that people are really keen to grow, is a little more challenging. We don't try to discourage people, but we like to of growing this, but we like people to know that this mushroom is a really slow grower. The fruiting bodies, the mycelium grows pretty fast, but the fruiting bodies take, weeks and weeks to grow. From fruiting, from pinning to harvest, this is 7 days from soaking. This is 5 days later, the same log on the left here. So that happens really fast. Whereas the reishi, this is incubated for about 15 months. And these mushrooms right here have been fruiting for about 6 weeks. And you can see the new white growth right here is still growing. Because they grow so slow, we actually bury the logs in pots in sand. I did try this outside, but it's just too cool in Humboldt County. So we have to put these in our greenhouse or in our glass solarium where at least daytime temperatures get up to the 80s. And then we can grow reishi in Eureka. This was a great picture a client sent me, one of our customers that did a forest thinning of tan oak down in Medicinal, and they took some post holes and they buried these logs into the ground, and then they took all the brush and packed it in this big giant Stonehenge of oak logs, and they created this giant moisture sink, and then they notched the logs out and packed spawn into the cuts. And it just worked like just an amazing, beautiful display. They put a sprinkler on the middle and did keep the logs wet for the first year, and then they just let it go wild. Someone asked, is the Nameko you mentioned here the same kind in Japan, or is it Phylliota adiposa, the chestnut mushroom? Oh, it's the same one from Japan. It's the Phylliota Nameko. It's actually, the common name's Nameko, and the Latin name's Nameko too. The chestnut mushroom is also, like you mentioned, a Phylliota, and super delicious. But we haven't tried that one on buried logs ourselves. But I know the Nameko works great on logs. Thanks for that question. And then someone else asked, any difference for lion's mane culture? Yes, we have some lion's mane. Oh, I didn't put those in the slide, but lion's mane is also a little more challenging than, say, oysters or shiitakes, which is kind of where we steer beginners to. Lion's mane can incubate in the logs for anywhere from 15 to 24 months before you get a fruiting body. It's a very, very slow grower. So you really need patience. You really need the right species of trees. Oysters and shiitakes seem more forgiving on their species variety, but you totally can be grown. It's a smaller yielder too, so you have to lower your expectations. Oysters, as we mentioned before, have one of the highest biological efficiency conversions, as you can see from this picture, where they just pick 50 pounds of oyster mushrooms. Reishis have some of the lowest, right? We're getting 2 mushrooms off of those logs like once a year. Shiitakes have a decent production, biological efficiency. So do Namekos, and lion's mane are pretty low, not as low as reishi, but they're pretty low. You'll get like 1 or 2 mushrooms per log, like once or twice a year. So hopefully that helps with your answer. Okay, last, somebody had another lion's mane question. Speaking of lion's mane, from your experience, what is the most suitable substrate and what are your challenges? Yeah, so the best thing to do would be to check out our species compatibility chart, but mostly what we've seen is it does okay on alder. I haven't tried it on maple or poplar, but that could be kind of in the same alder category. But it definitely likes oaks, the true oaks, the quercus, the white oaks, and the black oaks. We tried it on some tan oak and it wasn't super happy. We did get a little bit of fruitings, but it took a long time. It took like 2 or 3 years before they even fruited. So we definitely would recommend like true oaks for that. So last category here, and then I'll wrap this up, and we can do leave a few minutes for questions, is companion planting with mushrooms. Oh, thanks for that, Rebecca or Maria. Maria, someone just posted the compatibility chart from our website that you can see the rest of the species that what grows on what woods. So garden giant spawn, which is, these are Stropharia rugosa annulata. This is a delicious edible mushroom that loves our climate here. It's prolific, it's delicious. It sort of looks like a agaricus mushroom, like a portobello. It has, you know, gills and dark spores, but it has a flavor of more like a potato, and it just really, really delicious and super fun mushroom to grow. So here's the sawdust spawn. This has been, you know, the grain spawn inoculated onto sterilized sawdust. And then just like with the logs, this mycelium is aggressive enough that we can just grow it right outside in our garden. This was a demonstration bed we did where we put down wood shavings. We went to a local woodworker and we got some alder wood shavings, and then we added the spawn on top, and then we covered the whole thing with straw like that. And then this was in the fall, and then in the spring we had lots of mushrooms. And of course, you know, there's challenges. The slugs like them, squirrels nibble on them. You know, we have ducks, so we try to keep our ducks out in our garden as much as we can. But super fun mushroom. This was just a demonstration bed that we did for a class. But usually we incorporate them into our blueberries and around our fruit trees, anywhere we're putting lots and lots of mulch. So you can see, here's a picture of a friend of mine who mulched his blueberries in his garden with his poppies and his strawberries and his squash, and big trenches of wood chips. And he planted he inoculated the wood chip trenches with hardwood wood chips. And the mycelium went crazy and giant, massive fruiting. So this is why it's called the garden giant, because they'll get as big as a dinner plate. Now, obviously, this is this sort of edible, delectable stage before the right here. Even small button, really, really nice and tender. So we try to get them as fast as we can. Someone asked again, what's the name of these? So the Latin name is a mouthful. It's Stropharia rugosa annulata. The annulus, it has a giant persistent ring around here of the annulus. The common name you'll see is garden giants or wine caps. You'll see that a lot for the wine colored cap on top. So yeah, most of the time we're trying to pick them like this little younger one here that alder's holding, but they do get massive, and they're still pretty good. The stems can get kind of woody. You can get, oh, thanks, Maria, for posting that. Yeah, Stropharia rugosa annulata. Really fun mushroom to grow. It does outcompete harmful fungus in your garden. It does break the mulch down, the straw or the wood shavings or hardwood wood chips, fast enough to release nutrients and phosphorus into the soil. So just a great companion planter. It's been known to ward off nematodes, suppress other fungi like gray molds and stuff that get into your garden and will overwinter in mulch and stuff. So inland, we highly recommend people inoculate the gardens in the fall so they can get spring flushes and it has a wet season to establish itself. Early fall. On the coast, you can just about inoculate any time out in your garden, but spring's really great, especially if you know it's going to be somewhere where you can water it throughout the year. So we try to focus on areas that have drip systems or sprinklers and have crops or perennials that we're already watering throughout the dry season. So just a last couple slides, just talking about all the benefits of mushrooms. Our awareness and our understanding of what mushrooms have to offer us has grown tremendously. My partner's father sent me an article from the American Medical Journal, and I opened it up and I failed to look at the date at the top. And I started reading and it said, mushrooms, a bland, non-nutritious food with no vitamin or nutritional value. And I said, what is this? This is a horrible article. This sounds like a lot of people that come up to my booth at the fairs and ask me, are mushrooms good for you? Do mushrooms have any nutrients in them? And then I get to the bottom of the article and it's the American Medical Journal again, and they're laughing at themselves and saying, here's an article we posted 90 years ago when we knew nothing about the health benefits of mushrooms. And now we know better. Now we know that they're full of amino acids, they're full of proteins, they're full of vitamins and minerals. They're all kinds of beta-glucans, all kinds of immune-enhancing compounds that feed nerve endings, that feed red blood cells, that feed all kinds of immune responses in the body. And so, as you can tell, we're big fans of mushrooms around here, and we just like spreading the knowledge and letting people know what they can get and how they can incorporate them, into their diet and into their lifestyle. We like to encourage people to always cook mushrooms for lots of different reasons. First and foremost, they're not digestible raw, and so you're wasting your money. I think we're the only country in the world that serves raw mushrooms at the salad bar. But we highly encourage everyone to thoroughly cook their mushrooms. You're going to get much more benefit from being able to digest them. The chitins can't break down in our GI tract. So somebody asked, thinking plants mixed cropping system, is it a practice in mushroom cultivation to have a mixed system? Oh, so I think you're asking about mixing different kinds of mushrooms. Not so much. They're pretty territorial. They don't like sharing. So we don't recommend inoculating a log with more than one variety. And we wouldn't do the same. We would do the same in our garden. So if we were going to grow, bluets or agaricus or Stropharia or Prince agaricus or something in our garden, we would just give it that space for that one strain of fungi. These are some of the products we produce. We sell a lot of fresh mushrooms, and we do spice mixes, which we have at the co-op, and Moonrise Herbs and the Neal and Glen Farm Stand. And we also have our tinctures, and we also have our products at the Pearson Holiday Fair right now. So you can check them out there. Feel free to check out our website. Somebody asked when we might have Stropharia kits available. Yeah, so if you live on the coast, you can get them out pretty much anytime. It might be better to wait a month or two. We'll have kits available. They're almost ready now, so we'll probably start selling them by the end of the month. And then people can start getting them out in their garden in January, February, March, that folks that live on the coast. And folks that live inland can start getting them out in April and May. So definitely feel free to check back. We'll put them up on the website when they're available. You're welcome. Favorite mushroom textbook on cultivation, biology and cultivation of edible mushrooms. Oh yeah, that sounds like a great book. And Stamets's books. I have a couple. This is a nice, simple mushroom cultivation book. Really, really fun, easy to use. Stephen Russell, the Cultivating Mushroom Guide. And then those that are into medicinal mushrooms, this is one of the best books out right now, is the Fungal Pharmacy. I'll just show you those real quick. So yeah, check out our website, follow us on Instagram, Facebook. Usually we do lots of workshops and classes, and but with COVID, we'll just be doing some online stuff. We're maybe going to be doing a online cooking class series, and we will probably be doing some online cultivation classes too, coming in the early spring and stuff too. So feel free to get on our email list, and we usually always post our workshops on Facebook also. Someone said, what can you say about spore mass inoculation, mycelial fragmentation, and fermentation? That is a lot of subjects. I'll cover, I'll see what I can address about that. Spore mass inoculation. So that is practical in some situations, especially with native or secondary decomposers that will naturalize and outcompete local fungi here. So that can work in some applications for, say, something like Stropharia, which will grow on fresh straw or mulch. You could do spore mass inoculation. And so that's collecting a lot of spores and then making a slurry and spreading it around. As you can see with everything we covered today, we're looking at sapphiritic fungi that digest lignans, right? And so it's none of these that we're growing are mycorrhizal fungi. A lot of people try to experiment with spore mass inoculations with mycorrhizal fungi, like trying to spread, morels around and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I haven't tried that too much myself, but I have heard people have success, especially where they grow natively, say morels, and doing spore inoculations. I'm not sure what the question was about mycelial fragmentation and fermentation. So yeah, feel free to email me more about that question later. I'd love to chat about that. Somebody else asked, we did King Stropharia this year, huge producer. Unfortunately, we got a bad reaction from them at some point. Nausea, threw up. Oh, goodness. Any idea what happened? We did harvest them late. That's hard to say. I haven't heard of adverse reactions from Stropharia, but one of the common mushroom poisonings is eating old mushrooms. There's a lot of weird other fungi and bacteria that can grow on mushrooms. So it is good to make sure they're super fresh and young. And again, thoroughly cooking also seems to really reduce people's reaction. And making sure of your identification. Obviously, when you're growing mushrooms on logs or outdoors, you can get other fungi to come up in your garden or in your mushroom bed, usually not on logs until they're totally rotten and old, and then some other fungi will come in. So it's really important that you know what the Stropharia looks like and what a shiitake looks like, or any mushroom that you're ever eating. It's important that you know a correct identification. So yeah, sorry, that's sad to hear about your nausea experience. You're so welcome, Wesley Ford. Excellent talk. You're so welcome. You're welcome. From YouTube, starters that Levon mentions purchased from large manufacturers, are they clones or germinated or spores? Are there varieties in DNA mass-produced edible mushrooms? So starters, yes. So it's basically just somebody bred a variety of oyster mushrooms that's just super productive. So we can clone a wild oyster mushroom. And of course, that's where we got everything. Everybody started with wild shiitakes in Asia, and then they just bred them. So yes, they are a clone. That's what we're growing. It was most likely a tissue culture, or it started with spores. Spore breeding is a 2-hour-long conversation. And are there varieties in DNA of mass-produced edible mushrooms? I'm not sure what you meant exactly by that, but another question was, it was 100% King Stropharia. We had eaten them. Oh, back to the person that got sick, said they were 100% King Stropharia. We had eaten them for a few weeks without issue. Whoa, that's really interesting. So maybe, yeah, you built up an issue to them. A lot of people react to different mushrooms and foods. And so it's always good to eat a small amount and experiment first. It sounds like if it was over time, then yeah, either they were older or you built up a reaction. And if it was both of you that got sick, then that would more argue that you built up a reaction or that the mushroom was a little older or something. So yeah, that definitely can happen with any kinds of foods. If you eat too much of it all at once. I met a guy that got gout from shiitakes. He was drinking so much beer and he had so much shiitakes. He just ate shiitakes for weeks and weeks, and he got really bad gout because of all the protein in the shiitakes. So you never know, somebody from YouTube, can you talk a little bit more about wrapping grocery store bought oysters in wet cardboard? I'm a beginner. Oh yeah, totally. So it's just the stem. You don't want any of the caps, gills, or spores or anything. You just want the stem. Most mushrooms can do this, but oyster mushrooms can do this in a non-sterile environment. And the procedure goes like this. You take cardboard and you soak it in water. I started soaking it in hot water just to pasteurize a little bit, but if it's really clean cardboard, it seems to work totally fine. So you take a piece of cardboard. I don't have any cardboard right near me, but you take a piece of cardboard, double, triple thick layered, waffled cardboard, and you soak it in some hot water or regular water, and then you peel the cardboard apart, exposing the waffle in the middle. And then you take the oyster mushroom stem and you slice it in little slices. In fact, I came up with a trick. If you take the oyster mushroom stem and you leave it in the fridge in a Tupperware for about 2 or 3 days, it'll grow mycelium all over the stem. But either way, it works. You take the oyster mushroom stem and you slice the oyster mushroom stem up and you lay it in the little grooves of the cardboard, and then you sandwich it back together and you put it into a Ziploc bag, seal the Ziploc bag and put it on top of your fridge or somewhere warm in the dark. And it'll take about 2 weeks and the cardboard will be completely covered in white mycelium. And you basically have cardboard spawn now. And that cardboard spawn could go onto more cardboard, could go onto freshly pressed coffee grounds, could go onto pasteurized straw. Take some straw like we talked about, soak it in hot water, let it cool. We've done this with classes. I've had friends and customers do this. Take a bucket, drill some holes in it or a little container, put the straw in, stick the cardboard spawn in there, and the mycelium will jump off the cardboard onto the straw, and boom, now you have mushrooms growing all over the straw. And in a few weeks, you'll have oyster mushrooms coming out of the container. So yeah, it's really fun. Highly recommend. Do that with your kids. Do it for yourself. If you're stuck at home and your family and you need something to do, it's like really fun to goof around with because it's super user friendly. And it's really fun to watch mycelium grow in a plastic bag really fast like that. So great, folks. It looks like we're just about 9 o'clock. If you have any other questions, we have a couple minutes. Go ahead and type them into the chat room. Somebody asked, Clinton asked, have you produced lion's mane on other shrubs aside from logs? Yes. For our lion's mane, because logs is such a low producer, Ming said, thank you. You're welcome, Ming. Because lion's mane are such a slow producer, it's not profitable for us to produce them on logs for our tinctures. So we do sawdust. We use poplar and alder supplemented sawdust with wheat bran and lime. And that's the really only way we can produce it regularly, consistently, in a production level that's profitable for us. We do a few logs here and there just for fun, and we encourage people to try it out, and it's super fun. You just have to be really patient. But we do sawdust, but that takes a sterile environment. You're welcome, Rebecca. Yeah, so we do sterile sawdust inoculation in our laboratory in a sterile environment. What seeds do you use? Clinton asked, is that referring to the grain spawn? We use sterilized wheat berries. Basically any grain will work. People use corn, people use sorghum, people use rye. You'll see rye a lot on the internet. It's really cheap, especially in other parts of the country. We used wheat berries, organic wheat berries. Yeah, you're welcome. Radka asked, what is your experience with brown rice flour substrate? We don't use any flours. We do supplement with wheat bran in our sawdust, but the brown rice flour would be like a really intense nutrient. So if you added something like that, it would be a very, very low ratio as a supplementation. Pretty much anywhere you go in the world, you'll see people using whatever they have. So if they have, cocoa hull wastes, they'll use cocoa hull. If they have, sorghum waste, if they have rice hulls, if they have wheat bran, you can pretty much use lots of different carbonaceous material, but it really has to be in the right ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So that's like a pretty big subject. Clinton said, thanks, viewing from Belize. Awesome, Clinton, thanks for tuning in. From YouTube, we had a question, can you sterilize grain in an Instapot? All right, so I didn't get into the grain sterilization very much because grain sterilization, we do open air grain inoculation, which has to happen in front of a HEPA filter in a fully sterilized laboratory. But what we have now is injection ports, and we have started selling these, is sterilized grain with an injection port. And if you have a liquid culture syringe with liquid culture in it, you can do inoculations of your own grain in your own kitchen without a laboratory. So it's a really great breakthrough for hobby cultivation. And we've started selling sterilized grain bags with injection ports now. And we do also sell syringes with oyster. This is only going to work for oyster mushrooms because you can grow your own grain spawn and then the rest of it can happen open air inoculation. So otherwise, if you're trying to grow species like lion's mane or Nameko or maitake on sawdust, we also inoculate the sawdust in a sterile lab in a sterile environment. So it's hard to get away from that sterile lab without having a HEPA filter and stuff. But you can do oyster mushrooms and you can do a couple other species by using self-healing injection ports on pre-sterilized medium. And so we are offering that now of sterilized grain, sealed bags with injection ports and syringes. They're not up on our website yet, but they will be soon. But if you're interested, feel free to contact us. Great, folks. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you enjoy. I know we have another great speaker coming, talking about cooking with mushrooms soon. And make sure you sign up and register for the Humboldt Mycological Society, become a member. And it's MycoBlitz week. Maria, were you going to mention anything about that?
I was just going to say thank you so much to you.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
That was fantastic. I don't know how you read and talk at the same time. It was blowing my mind. I've just been so impressed.
I do have that special power. I can't spell very well, but I can read and talk at the same time. So yeah, it's our MycoBlitz week with the Humboldt Bay Mycological Society. We're asking people to download iNaturalist and geotag mushrooms they find in Humboldt and the surrounding counties. And it's going to be a virtual mushroom fair. And we have lots of great hikes and lots of great presentations. So yeah, become a member, join our Facebook page. And these videos are also being put up on YouTube. And so you'll be able to find them there to watch for people that missed them. Heidi, you're welcome. Thanks for watching. And Maria just put the iNaturalist link in the chat box. Andrew, you're welcome. Thanks, everybody. It was great to have you all here. Hopefully we'll meet in person soon again in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much, Levon.
Thanks.
All right,
Maria.
everybody.
Good night.
I'm closing it down.
All right.
Good
Bye,
night.
Rebecca. Bye, Maria.